Hi. So, the wonderful thing about having a YouTube channel and something of a platform is that I can talk about literally whatever I want to. That's more or less how all of this started, really, just having all these thoughts and opinions on very specific, very niche subjects and no one to talk about them with. And even if a video of mine doesn't perform well, doesn't necessarily go viral, it always makes me happy to see just any amount of people really genuinely listen to me and learn about these things that are important to me, and also actively discuss them. It really truly is one of my most favorite and most rewarding things about this job. And all of that is to say that this video might be one of the most self-indulgent videos I've ever done, and I'm no stranger to picking video topics just because they've been on my mind and I wanted to talk about them. But this specifically is a video topic that caters so much to me, specifically, because yes, I am a doll collector who loves dolls, first and foremost. That is my primary hobby, but I'm also someone who really loves superheroes, specifically on the comics and the animation side of things. And that's what this video is all about, by the way, superhero dolls. But I've always loved dolls. I've been playing with dolls basically from birth, but I've also kind of always loved superheroes. I was brushing my mermaid fantasy Barbie's hair while watching reruns of Justice League and Batman the Animated Series and X-Men Evolution, which when I got a little older turned into my mom taking me to monthly trips to the comic book store. Sometimes I'd pick up a Wonder Woman or a Star Sapphire action figure and I'd put her on my shelf next to all my dolls, and they lived in harmony. And don't get me wrong, I don't think that makes me particularly special or anything. I'm sure lots of people grew up doing very similar things, but it's an experience that has kind of stuck with me, because when I think back to that side of my childhood, I always remember feeling somewhat alienated in a way that's kind of difficult to describe. When I watched Justice League, it was for Wonder Woman. When I watched Batman, it was for Poison Ivy and Catwoman. X-Men, it was Kitty Pryde. I had so much love and admiration for these confident, powerful, beautiful women that I saw. But when you grow up as a young boy who finds role models in female characters, there's always this implication that you're doing something wrong, that you're supposed to identify with and admire the male characters, not the women, especially, if you are a boy who is not necessarily attracted to these women. That's a whole subject on its own. I remember being very young and being so excited when reruns of Xena Warrior Princess would come on. I'm probably, 4 or 5 years old, and I'm just so enchanted by this woman on the TV screen. And all the adults, of course, think it's because I have this little crush on her, right? No, I don't want to be with Xena. I want to be like Xena. But how does a little kid even begin to explain that? And even though I can't speak to the experience of growing up as a girl who engaged with a lot of superhero media, I imagine it was even worse and a lot more alienating. And for that reason, I always felt so much more at home in female-oriented media. The Winx Club, the Totally Spies, the Sailor Moon, and all the other magical girls I discovered later. They were, by the strictest definition, superheroes. They were powerful women I could love and admire without this big, weird asterisk next to it all, and without feeling like my other interests were being sacrificed or demeaned. God, this is a lot of preamble. Sorry. But as I said, this is my time to be self-indulgent. Anyways, even though I never really felt included in superhero stuff, I still loved it. I still loved these characters. But these two interests of mine always felt like they were completely separate worlds. And as regressive as it is to say out loud, they felt very much like boy stuff and girl stuff, and never shall the twain meet, right? But that's just how it was. Which brings me to the thesis of today's video. Looking over the times, companies specifically tried to market dolls as superheroes, and also why historically they've continuously failed in doing so. And it won't be an all-encompassing overview of every superhero doll that has ever existed because, let's be real, superhero is a very broad category, and there are superhero properties that are aimed specifically at girls, like a lot of magical girls, as I mentioned before. So for the purpose of this video, I'm using superhero in the sense of like taking a property that was primarily aimed at young boys and attempting to make it more accessible or more appealing to young girls by utilizing a fashion doll line. I also want to limit the discussion to brands that are aimed at children, because the optics are a little different with stuff aimed at adults. And because there have been a lot of, Wonder Woman Barbies, Catwoman Barbies, there were some Marvel Barbies, Star Wars Barbies, but these were, for the most part, for adult collectors. And I also don't think they did anything particularly wrong, like the examples I will discuss here. Okay, so you got all that? I guess that's all just to say that I feel very qualified to speak on this subject as someone who spends entirely too much time thinking about toys and is very opinionated about things most people do not care about. So let's just get into it. I think the concept of a superhero doll line has been around for a very long time. She-Ra, Princess of Power, is probably the earliest, most significant example, and also fits the criteria, too, when you think about it, because it took a property aimed at boys, He-Man, and made it more appealing to an audience of young girls by the way of long, brushable hair and glittery fabrics. And let me be clear, She-Ra is not being brought up as an example because she's a failure. For one, she wasn't. Objectively, she did pretty well for herself as a spinoff, and obviously she had a lot of pop culture impact too. I bring up She-Ra because she is very much the progenitor, ground zero, and also a good example of how to do this sort of thing correctly, which is to maintain everything that made the original boy-focused series so appealing. Colorful, inspiring characters, action-adventure elements, cool weapons, and powers. Keep all of that, but also introduce these traditionally feminine elements. Fashion, unicorns, glamorous hairstyles, and play it straight. I mean, unicorns specifically aren't mandatory, but I like unicorns. What I'm trying to say is commit. Don't include these elements just to be patronizing, which is a very fine line. Yes, because introducing these things can become very stereotypical and demeaning if you don't do it with a pure heart and pure intentions. But also, very pointedly not including these elements is a detriment too, and we'll get to that. So She-Ra was 1985 and inspired a lot of very similar doll lines. In fact, I actually have it in my little running list of video topics one day to go over all the doll lines that were very obviously derivative of She-Ra. So that's another video, because they were all mostly original properties. We don't get another good example of turning a boy's superhero property into a doll line until around 1993, and it's actually a doll line that was totally unreleased. In 1993, or I guess technically around 1992, Mattel teamed up with DC Comics to conceptualize a doll line, Wonder Woman and the Star Riders, which, if it came out, would have featured Wonder Woman alongside a team of female superheroes and their matching coordinated unicorns that they rode, hence Star Riders. The dolls were about 6 inches tall, so half the size of a standard Barbie, and around the same scale as the original She-Ra dolls. There were also plans to incorporate an animated TV series to tie in with the dolls, but as we very well know, that did not happen. And to this very day, Wonder Woman has yet to receive her own animated series. So alongside Wonder Woman, there was a mix of new characters and established ones from the comics that were redesigned to fit this line's aesthetic. For returning characters, there was, obviously, Wonder Woman. There was Dolphin, who was known at the time for being an ally of Aquaman, and Ice, whose name I feel is entirely self-explanatory. The newcomers were Star Lily, who had plant and flower-based powers, and Solara, who had powers to do with sunlight. And there was also Persia, the resident cat-themed villainess. By the way, big shout out to the website Jewel Riders Archive for preserving scans of the Toy Fair booklet that these images came from. They are, as far as I know, the only real photographs of the doll prototypes that exist that we ever got. Because that's where these dolls were first shown off, the 1993 Toy Fair, where retailers showed very little interest in them, and Mattel ultimately decided that the line must not be worth releasing, so they didn't. They canceled it. The only physical release from Wonder Woman and the Star Riders that ever came to be was a very small, short, and very bare-bones comic book that was included in boxes of Kellogg's cereal, the pages of which you can also read at the Jewel Riders Archive. So big thanks to them yet again. As for why Wonder Woman and the Star Riders didn't pan out, or rather why retailers weren't interested in the dolls, I don't know. I mean, I can make a good few assumptions that they didn't think they would sell well, that they didn't have faith in a comic-based IP being aimed at young girls, that they didn't think a Wonder Woman cartoon would attract a lot of viewers, etc., etc. But I wasn't there at the 1993 Toy Fair, unfortunately, so I don't really know for certain. Another interesting example of this, and one of my personal favorites, Power Rangers. For girls. Yes, that is literally what they called this doll line. It says right here, Power Rangers for girls. I've talked about these a few times here on this channel. I even did a dedicated unboxing of them, like way back in the day. But I will take any excuse to continue talking about them because I think they are just so delightful. If you don't know, these are from 1994, I want to say, and they came into existence because toy executives noticed that they were struggling to meet demands for Pink Ranger toys. Now, unlike the seasons of Power Rangers that I grew up with, Mighty Morphin here did actually make an effort to be an ostensibly gender-neutral show. They wanted an audience of both young boys and young girls. But because of its subject matter, it would still garner this reputation as primarily a boys' franchise. But there were plenty of young female fans. So when they produced toys, they were usually sure to include all of the Rangers, the whole lineup. This would not be the case later on, as I said. But in the mid-90s, there was a good selection of toys for the Pink and Yellow Rangers. I couldn't find any confirmation that the Kimberly and Trini toys were produced in lower quantities, but I do suspect that to be the case. And when demand rose for more products of the female characters, Bandai answered the call with these, Power Rangers for girls. And let me just read you the back of the box. It's my favorite thing ever. Share the thrilling adventures of Kimberly the Pink Ranger and Trini the Yellow Ranger as they battle evil space aliens. When the world is safe once again, dress Trini in her shorts and vest outfit and Kimberly in her pink mini dress. brush out their beautiful hair, and they're ready for high school, where they always get straight A's and dazzle all the boys. These lasted for about a full year. We did also get a doll of Aisha as the Yellow Ranger, as well as a 2-pack with different outfits. Oh, and a carrying case playset. I do think if you were going to make a Power Rangers doll line, this is really exactly how you should do it. Because they still have their ranger suits, they still have their blasters, and they also have cute outfits and beautiful brushable hair. Best of both worlds. Though I guess if I was going to complain retroactively 30 years later, they could have maybe included their weapons and maybe have made the dolls a little more posable for like action purposes. But I guess I can see why these didn't sell too well. It does perhaps feel a little bit patronizing, especially calling it, Power Rangers for girls. Maybe that was not the move. Though they did eventually drop that and started calling it Power Rangers Girls instead, which is marginally better. Speaking of straightforward titles, DC Superhero Girls from 2016, which is another franchise that I really want to do a full retrospective on. The groundwork is being laid, it will happen, but to give a very brief overview, DC Superhero Girls is exactly what it sounds like. Another slightly more successful effort by Mattel and DC Comics to make the superhero genre more accessible and appealing to young girls. This time by following the precedent and the formula set by Mattel's other franchises at the time, namely Monster High and Ever After High. So DC Superhero Girls sees the characters age down to high school level, attending a school for superheroes, which is very creatively named Superhero High School. The first lineup of characters included Wonder Woman, Supergirl, Batgirl, Poison Ivy, Harley Quinn, and Bumblebee. Katana was frequently included in promo materials as a main character, but I'm like 95% certain they only did this because they desperately needed another character who wasn't white in this lineup, because she wasn't actually heavily featured in either the doll line or the promotional web series. Her first doll was a San Diego Comic-Con exclusive, and then she got a very scaled down version later on. Appropriately for a superhero series, this doll line is very lore heavy and also character focused. So it has its own web series and full-length animated specials with their own stories. You see other characters here and there that also eventually get dolls, like Starfire, Cheetah, Hawk Girl, and Frost, who is Killer Frost, but this is a kid's toy line. Oh my god, you can't say kill. My favorite character was Star Sapphire, who's always been one of my favorite DC Comics characters, but here she's portrayed as this spoiled, stuck-up, almost kind of mean girl archetype, which is definitely watering down Carol's character a lot, but I don't mind because she was just so fun. Unfortunately, though, she never got a doll. I think DC Superhero Girls did a lot of things very correctly right out of the gate. I do remember having some misgivings, particularly with the way it just chose to portray some of the characters. And I also questioned if it was entirely necessary to make them teenagers in a school setting, but I still think it had some really good ideas. Particularly the dolls themselves. I wish I had some with me to show off, but they were all in my old collection that I don't have anymore. Anyways, they were made to be specifically a hybrid between a fashion doll and an action figure. Yes, I know the terms are arbitrary. I actually have a whole video over that entire subject. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. But they were made to be fashion dolls with all the making of a fashion doll, brushable hair and outfits you can mix and match, but with the sturdiness and the posability and the play potential of action figures. And I think they accomplished that really well. The bodies for these dolls were very well made, very well articulated, and it was actually a selling point that the dolls could stand on their own. And they could. I remember that they could pretty well. The outfits, I mean, maybe they could be a little better, particularly Harley Quinn. I've always hated this look on her, but they're all recognizable. The looks are fun, the quality is decent, everything that it needs is there. They also released straightforward action figures too, in case, a kid would prefer them over the dolls. Really, again, best of both worlds, and DC and Warner Bros. Both saw this as a very ambitious project too. To quote an LA Times press release from 2016, "I think girls have been ignored for a long time," said Deborah Snyder, who is producing Wonder Woman, Justice League, and other films for Warner Bros. "Girls like action. It's important for girls to see themselves as the hero." Investors have also been pressuring Warner Bros. To do more with their female heroes. At a 2014 shareholder meeting, executives were questioned about why the studio was not doing more with these characters from its library. At the time, Nelson told investors that the company was working on projects that would appeal to young girls. "This is not a flash-in-the-pan opportunity for us," said Nelson, president of DC Entertainment, in a recent interview. "We believe this is a big business." To speak on the cartoon as well, it's alright. It's very okay. Overwhelmingly just okay. I think the animation style is a little too stiff for a superhero show. Action sequences are frequently pretty minimal and kind of rigid, which sort of defeats the purpose. The stories are often pretty predictable, but they're not terrible. They're definitely not bad. I just got the impression that the people working on them weren't too familiar with superhero stuff, or maybe they just weren't entirely comfortable working on superhero stuff, if that makes sense. But as a starting point for getting young girls interested in these characters and engaging with DC media and, eventually moving on to their other properties, I think it did a good job of serving that purpose. Unfortunately, things went downhill pretty quickly too, because Mattel is Mattel, and almost immediately after releasing this first wave of dolls, they dropped the fashion doll premise, almost entirely. We did get some releases with, real outfits, but we also got a lot of these dolls that were just fully plastic, no fabric. Or if they did have clothes, they just weren't very well designed, or fun, or worth buying. So no one did buy them, and the line died out 2 years after it launched. And furthermore, many of these dolls even completely lacked the extra articulation. So you don't get the fashion doll or the action figure aspect. It is actually baffling to me almost how utterly quickly they completely drained all the life and all the fun out of this doll line. It went from the best of both worlds to actually being the worst of both worlds. All the worst aspects of both fashion dolls and the worst aspects of action figures to create some of the most unappealing products ever. And when they had a very decently good foundation too. But that's classic Mattel, right? Get a good thing going and then immediately cut corners at every possible place and put out the bare minimum. If that. Which is sad, because I really don't think the original version of DC Superhero Girls was ever allowed to reach its full potential. It didn't die completely, though. It just sort of fizzled out. And from its ashes, in 2019, rose DC Superhero Girls. Again, but different. The second iteration of DC Superhero Girls was primarily an animated series. Unlike the first incarnation, where the cartoon was more of a promotional material, this time the franchise revolved almost entirely around the cartoon, which was full-length and aired on Cartoon Network. This version of the show was developed by Lauren Faust of My Little Pony Friendship is Magic fame, and the lineup was switched around a little bit, with the main characters being Wonder Woman, Batgirl, Supergirl, Bumblebee, Zatanna, and Jessica Cruz as Green Lantern. Harley Quinn and Poison Ivy are still there, but now primarily as villains. And Katana also makes some appearances too later on. Overall, I really enjoyed this show. I like it quite a lot, actually. I think some of the portrayals of certain characters are pretty hit or miss, but it's also really clever in the way it incorporates characters and plots from the DC canon. Like, the people working on this show knew and cared about the source material, and it really showed. Even if they didn't take it quite as seriously as some people might have liked. So I think it's a success in that sense, but it is absolutely a failure as a doll line. And it is really just for one simple reason. The dolls are kind of ugly. They just are. I'm sorry. The more stylized and exaggerated style of the cartoon is fun, but it just really did not translate well to fashion dolls. And like, that's neither a commentary on the show's art style nor the standard of fashion dolls. It's just an objective fact that these dolls came out looking pretty aesthetically challenged. Hi, editing here. I just wanted to pop in because I remembered that actually what we got on shelves ended up being a lot better than what could have been, if you can believe it. Because I recalled seeing pictures of prototypes from, I think it was Toy Fair, and oh my god, it was actually so much worse. And they were completely serious, too. And now that I look at them, like, pretty incoherent, too, like, standing all next to each other, they just don't look like they belong together. It's so weird. They definitely made an effort, like, they tried. But as you can imagine, they weren't a hit, and the dolls did not last very long. They were canceled before we got a Poison Ivy doll, which I actually think is pretty sad, because she was absolutely the best looking one. But rewind a little to 2018, where we see Marvel Comics team up with Hasbro to do more or less the same exact thing. If you're someone who is coming from the doll side of things and you aren't familiar with comics, the best way I know to describe Marvel and DC's relationship is very much like that of Mattel and MGA. So you see where I'm going with this. This is Hasbro, though, who I guess at the time also did have some pretty heavy beef with Mattel over the whole Disney Princesses license fiasco. But if I keep going, I'm going to get really off track. Anyways, this is where I admit I am primarily a DC girly. I do dabble in Marvel. I do love a lot of Marvel characters. I've followed some of the comics, but I'm not as intimately familiar with its canon, or canons, plural. And I definitely do not care even a little bit about the MCU. I'm sorry. I liked Runaways. Nico Minoru, that's my girl. But I've seen maybe 2 MCU movies, and I'm not even entirely confident in that number. But Marvel Rising, it came out in 2018, and like DC Superhero Girls, was a multimedia project. It had both a short web series and full-length animated specials that aired on Disney XD. And, of course, dolls. The primary cast of Marvel Rising was America Chavez, Ms. Marvel, Gwen Stacy as Ghost Spider, Quake, Squirrel Girl, and Patriot. Not a bad lineup for this sort of thing. Definitely far more diversity than DC Superhero Girls had. Oh, also, that's actually another thing in this line's favor. The characters had unique body types, which at the time in 2018 was actually still a pretty novel concept for a doll line. And I'm grateful Hasbro went the extra mile for that. I also think the style of the animation is a lot more appealing. I understand that this is a Marvel and a Disney combo, so they probably had access to much more experienced studios and a much higher budget allocated for animation. But the aesthetic of the animation just lends itself way more to action sequences and character movement, so overall, it's just kind of easier to watch. Where Marvel Rising loses me, though, is definitely the dolls. And it suffered from almost exactly the same set of issues that DC Superhero Girls did, except almost worse in a way, because at least DC Superhero Girls redesigned the character outfits to reflect that this was a fashion doll line. And it did so without making the characters too traditionally feminine in a way that would have been out of character. But they still look, fun and stylish and visually interesting. And also distinct. Every character has a very distinct aesthetic. When I look at the Marvel Rising dolls, I don't know if this critique is going to make sense, but I just don't see anything that justifies them being fashion dolls, These could have been action figures, and that would have been perfectly fine and still served the purpose of selling products to promote these animated specials and vice versa. I think this might just be me, personally, just not enjoying the overall aesthetic of Marvel products, especially around this time, because they were very afraid, I guess, of being too campy. Everything has to be so serious, and you get superhero designs that just lack a sense of whimsy. And maybe that's what I want from them, a little more whimsy. If you're going to make a fashion doll line, I think it's very important that you don't actively object to things that make fashion dolls, And if you don't want to include these things, then that's perfectly fine. A line of action figures aimed primarily at girls is a solid concept unto itself. But a fashion doll line that makes no use of things like fashion or individual styles or fun aesthetics, it fails at being a fashion doll line. But Marvel Rising did exactly the same thing that DC Superhero Girls did and started putting out dolls in these hideous, under-designed outfits with little to no extra articulation. So again, it's literally, what is the point? And the line was canceled, I think, only after about a year. And you can argue that it would be out of character for this cast to care about looking stylish or fashionable or even just aesthetically pleasing. And that might be true to an extent, but in that case, why not use characters that historically do care about these things? Hello, Wasp? Emma Frost? Storm? Dazzler? I guess they specifically wanted teenagers, which is fair, but my point still stands. And again, I understand it's a fine line. You don't want a superhero doll line to be all about fashion and makeup and glitter, because that can be demeaning and stereotypical. Valid point. Counterpoint, we are talking about fashion dolls and appealing to an audience that, if they're engaging with fashion dolls, probably already has a cursory interest in those things. And a female character, or even a male character, being interested in fashion does not make them any weaker or any less of a role model. And I do think that's a pretty common pitfall when you make a franchise like this, being too afraid of being girly, because you think being girly is something that makes characters weak. And to be so very clear, so extremely specific so that no one misunderstands my point, I do not think superhero toys should all be super feminine and glamorous and pretty. Would I love that? Yes. Put Batman in a corset and some kicky heels. Absolutely. But I do not think it's a necessity. I am specifically talking about superhero properties that want to be fashion dolls, and why they might have failed at appealing to an audience of people who buy fashion dolls. Also, in the interest of fairness, I do want to talk about an example that goes too far in the other direction. Barbie Princess Power, which kind of breaks my own rule because it's not based on an established property, unless you count Barbie. But it's relevant because it's a good example of what happens when there's not enough superhero in your superhero doll line. Barbie Princess Power is just kind of not a very good movie in general, and much of that is because you can tell it just really, really doesn't want to be a superhero movie. It's just thoroughly uninterested in including any kind of action. And when it does, it's either fully slapstick or just the bare minimum, which is unfortunate because Barbie as a superhero should be a really fun concept. But They were not having fun with Barbie Princess Power. It just completely lacks a commitment to its theme. The one compliment I can offer is that Barbie's superhero outfit looks pretty cool. I do like the design. It just looks pretty sad in doll form. And I guess at this point, you don't need me to say it. It's a lot of plastic, very little fabric, which means very little value as a fashion doll. And a lot of the dolls from the movie lack posability too, which means very little value as an action figure. Also, Super Sparkle is the worst superhero name I've ever heard. It's like actually insultingly bad and indicative of how much this movie really cared about the superhero genre, I think. I think the optimal answer to this problem that's not really a problem is to just include a cast of characters with a wide range of hobbies and interests. Sports, fashion, technology, etc., which I think the 2019 version of DC Superhero Girls accomplished pretty well, actually. It's also just kind of a no-brainer. There's one more doll line I want to talk about here, and it is admittedly one I'm kind of tacking on just to make a point, because it isn't technically a superhero doll line. It's another one by Hasbro, Star Wars Forces of Destiny. Yes, Star Wars is a sci-fi series, not a superhero series. Don't hurt me, please. But it's the same principle. Taking a franchise known for primarily being aimed at boys and making products aimed at girls. But I really wanted to include this doll line specifically because I think it's probably a good example of doing absolutely everything incorrectly. I know Jenny Nicholson made a whole video a while back over these, and I remember watching it and I remember agreeing with it, though I don't remember everything she said. And I thought about rewatching it for the purposes of this video, but I decided against it for two important reasons. One, I don't want that video to influence my thoughts too much. And two, I have a very important piece of context here. I do not know anything about Star Wars. I've never seen a Star Wars. I barely know some of the characters' names. So I thought it would actually serve this video's topic more to give my opinion on this doll line as someone who is not a fan of Star Wars and knows very, very little about the franchise. But doesn't that make all of your criticisms invalid, you might ask? And I say no, not at all. It would be if I was talking about like collector level Star Wars products. Yes, it absolutely would. But you have to keep in mind that these dolls were not really aimed at established Star Wars fans, nor were the DC Superhero Girls or the Marvel Rising were for comic book fans. They were one part of the intended audience, yes, but they were also meant to serve as a means to capture a new audience, to be an accessible introduction to these characters and the source material. And I can say unequivocally that as a fashion doll fan, Forces of Destiny does not make me interested in Star Wars or interested in learning more about these characters. Like, even a little bit, and that's why it fails. First off, when I look at this lineup, I see 3 of the same woman, and I at least know enough about Star Wars to know that they are not all the same woman, but in the context of this doll line, they are almost indistinguishable. It is 3 brunette women dressed in, like, beige rags. So already I'm kind of checked out. Sabine at least looks pretty cool. Obviously she stands out. Her source material is a cartoon, right? So that's probably why. However, I think she still fails as a fashion doll, as do all the other ladies here, because there's no fashion aspect. Almost all the dolls come with completely molded on plastic outfits with like a little bit of fabric, maybe a vest, or in Sabine's case, some pants. So it lacks memorable and interesting designs and also the playability of a fashion doll. And while it might succeed in articulation and action, again, that begets the question, why bother making a fashion doll? I also watched the animated shorts they released, and while they did have a nice art style and some pretty decent animation, they didn't really tell me anything about the characters. other than, like, they're nice to baby aliens, which I feel like should be the bare minimum of a Star Wars heroine. It feels a little too presumptuous on my part to talk about how they could have improved this line. But even though I've never seen Star Wars, I did major in costume design. And Padme's outfits from the prequel films, right? That's where she's from? Those ones? Her outfits are both incredibly well documented and also referenced a lot when talking about costume design, because she has a lot of really incredible, stunning, interesting, glamorous outfits to draw from. She even got dolls during the original run of the movies, too. I see them all the time in antique stores. And the thing is, Padme wearing pretty dresses doesn't make her any less capable or compelling of a character. I mean, I assume she is. She seems pretty well liked. And obviously the concept of glamour and fashion and color exists in the Star Wars universe. So why not utilize that? Again, why are we so afraid of being labeled girly? Why is that such a terrible thing? Much to unpack. But as you might have guessed, this doll line did not do very well and was canceled after only a year. They did release a few male dolls for it, though. One for Luke Skywalker, who I actually think is pretty cute, and also one for Kylo Ren, who might be the ugliest man I've ever seen in my life. But established Star Wars fans might have different opinions from me. They might love this doll line with their whole heart, and they are valid. I just think, they failed on every level of being appealing as a fashion doll line, which I guess is fine if you, hate fashion dolls. That might be a good thing. But also, if you hate fashion dolls, how did you get here? Anyways, that's all I wanted to talk about, and I think I definitely talked enough. I don't think I have any extra points to make because I feel like I covered all my bases pretty well. I hope I did. I do hope one day we get another doll line that blends together both fashion and superhero concepts, because I really don't think those worlds have to be so mutually exclusive. They can coexist in harmony with the right intentions and the right budget. But until then, I will always have Precure, so I guess I'm happy. Now, though, it is your turn. I want you to tell me if you've bought any of the dolls I've talked about today. Did you like them? Did you hate them? What do you think they did right? What do you think they did wrong? What, in your opinion, is the best way to go about making a superhero fashion doll line? Whatever's on your mind, tell it to me down there in the comments. And remember, keep it cute.